Welcome to Nancy's Classic Bedtime Stories. Tonight I'm going to read from Let Us Talk of Many Things by William F. Buckley, Jr., the collected speeches. I'm going to begin with acknowledgments, and then I will continue with the foreword before we begin reading one of the speeches. All right, let's begin. This book has been compiled at the prompting of the publisher, Mr. Stephen Martin of Prima Publishing. I remember rather offhandedly agreeing to undertake the job. I knew it would be onerous, but did not guess quite how much would be involved. Apart from debates and talks at Yale, I began speaking publicly when my first book, God and Man at Yale, was published. Requests from myriad groups, mostly colleges, came in, and soon I retained a lecture agent. For many years, I gave 70 or more lectures a year. I continue to lecture now, but less often. The compiling of the talks for this book was a huge endeavor. My debt, complete, prostrate, eternal, is to Linda Bridges. Miss Bridges, a graduate of the University of Southern California, where she specialized in French literature and modern English, had served as managing editor of National Review, the magazine that I founded, and served as editor for 35 years. Miss Bridges devoted the better part of 1 year to putting together this material. The first job was to collect the speeches. A few were with my other papers in archives at the Yale University Library. Many were in office files, and many more were on computers. The next step was to eliminate repetitions. This proved difficult because a talk substantially repeated would be slightly and sometimes critically different in different situations, always different in introductory sections, and sometimes in the body of the speech as well. Every repeated speech set to one side, Linda, I can't continue with Miss Bridges, listed 184 speeches, all different. To have published the lot would have meant a book with 350,000 words. Gone with the Wind is 250,000 words. On no account, Mr. Martin said sternly, could the book come to more than 175,000 words. That was when I got the bright idea. Why not include, at the end of the book, a CD in which the whole shebang would repose in the event that students, friendly or unfriendly, wanted access to the oeuvre. That idea popped onto Mr. Martin's desk, proved what the French call a fausse idée claire, a terrific idea that doesn't work. Pardon my French, I do not speak French. Mr. Martin said that to enclose the CD would mean adding $10 to the price of the book, making it unmarketable. This is not a collection of talks opposing the working of the marketplace, and so I yielded. The CD idea may flower in a future special edition suitable for libraries and for readers especially curious to go on beyond where they are taken here. Linda then graded the talks according to her judgment of their vitality and variety. Blue ink meant necessary, green ink qualified, red ink can do without. The blue inked ones, plus one or two of the greens, added up to 230,000 words. We cut, in some cases with some sadness, 17 more speeches, leaving us with the present number. I have introduced each entry with a few words designed to give the reader information I think useful. The initial talk is included primarily because of its auspices. It was the class day oration of the 1950 graduating class of Yale University. I wince a little on reading what I wrote as a 24-year-old, but that's good, they say. The perspective that makes you critical of yesterday's work. The final talk in this volume is introduced by my son, Christopher Buckley, the talented humorist, novelist, and editor. We attempted, in the 90-odd speeches in between, to achieve a balance, some of the weightier material, some of the lighter material, a great many oriented to one person, testimonials and eulogies. I thought to begin the book with the essay I wrote a few years ago for The New Yorker on some of the trials of public speaking. a useful few pages, lighthearted and informative, about what it is actually like to travel from city to city, college to college, as has been done for so many centuries by poets, politicians, ideologues, and promoters. And then I thought to ask David Brooks to do me the honor of a formal introduction, which, as of this writing, I have not seen. Mr. Brooks, who serves as an editor of the Weekly Standard, was an undergraduate journalist at the University of Chicago at the time of my book Overdrive was published. His hilarious put down of it in the Chicago Undergraduate Daily was so funny that I reprinted the whole of it in the introduction to the paperback edition. We have since forgiven each other. I swore I would mention only Linda Bridges in this introduction, but I cannot omit mention of Francis Bronson, who since 1968 has looked at me, after me, my papers, my articles, speeches, problems, deadlines. Here is another mention of my gratitude and my indebtedness. William F. Buckley, Stamford, Connecticut, November 1999. And now I will continue with the foreword by David Brooks. There's one question I have always longed to ask Bill Buckley, but I've never worked up the nerve. Are you content? Millions of people set off on their lives hoping to build some lasting legacy, to make some immortal impression upon the world. They're driven hour upon hour, day upon day, to write the next essay, or to do the next deal, or paint the next painting. But only a few people in the world actually can sit back knowing beyond doubt that they have succeeded. They have altered the course of events and surpassed all realistic expectations. Bill Buckley is one of those few. No Buckley, no conservative movement, no Ronald Reagan. You fill in the rest. I like to think that at least for those few, there is some sort of cosmic payoff. I'd like to think they experience a grand and delicious sense of tranquility that serves as an oasis after all the years on airplanes and meetings or in front of the keyboard. But maybe one of the reasons I've never asked Bill Buckley this question is that I sense he'd tell me there is no sublime contentment. There are always more speeches to be given, more controversies to be addressed, more points to be made. After all, even today, in what in some senses is retirement, Buckley continues to give more talks, write more columns, and attend to more disputes than most people do in their prime. There's obviously some spur still driving him on, and maybe he'd add that the kind of oasis I'm talking about isn't to be found in this fallen world, which literally is a shame. There are a lot of speeches in the book you hold in your hands, and they reveal a lot about Bill Buckley, but they also reveal a lot about world history over the past 50 years. These are primary documents that take you straight back to the atmosphere of the Cold War, the 1960s, Watergate, the Reagan years. Suddenly you are back in the audience in 1950 when a 24-year-old William F. Buckley Jr. challenges the powers at Yale University. In 1960, when he addresses a rally at Carnegie Hall gathered in protest of Nikita Khrushchev's American visit. In 1962, when he faces off against Norman Mailer in a packed amphitheater in Chicago. These are thrilling confrontations, but if you're like me, you will read them with a sense of tristesse. There's a word that we got to look up. We're going to have to look up some words, and I'm going to definitely have some word lookups after reading this. The debates in those early days seemed so much more dramatic. The issues were fundamental, and without question, there was a wider gulf between left and right. Liberalism was then at its most outrageous, and Buckley was a little outrageous himself. Debating the New Yorker Post's James Weschler in 1959, Buckley assailed, "I cannot think of a single word James Weschler, a spokesman for American liberalism and a product of it, has ever uttered, or a deed he has done, that could be proved to have given comfort to slaves behind the Iron Curtain, whose future as slaves would be as certain in a world governed by James Weschler as the future of slaves in Atlanta would have been in an American government by Jefferson Davis. He doesn't tell us whether they shook hands after that exchange. A few pages further on, the reader comes to that Mailer debate, and what fun it must have been to see. The topic for the event was the meaning of the American right wing, and Buckley doubts the subject with will be of much interest to Mr. Mailer. I am not sure we have enough sexual neuroses for him, but if we have any at all, no doubt he will find them and celebrate them. But Buckley goes on to hope that Mailer will show some contempt for conservatism. I do not know anyone whose dismay I personally covet more, because it is clear from reading the works of Mr. Mailer that only demonstrations of human swishiness are truly pleasing to him. This is not genteel analyses on the Charlotte Rose show, nor is this a couple of pundits cross-talking on the Capitol gang. This is debate at a much higher level, at once funnier, more serious, and more vicious. This is incivility with the purpose. Especially in the 1950s and 1960s, Buckley was a provocateur. But he was not only that, for mixed in here you will find theological orations, often in the form of commencement addresses, in which Buckley talks seriously about serious things. He was certainly not playing to the crowds. There are a few talks in this book I could never have followed while sitting on some folding chair on a sunny spring afternoon in my cap and gown. Buckley clearly wasn't going to go down to the level of his audiences. He was going to force them up to his. Maybe you can't be the leader of a movement unless you possess this instinctive force of will. And as the pages roll by, you see Buckley emerging as the leader of the conservative movement. There is the striking talk he gave on September 11th, 1964, to the National Convention of the Young Americans for Freedom. Barry Goldwater is going to lose the coming Americans for free. Barry Goldwater is going to lose the coming election, he tells them, but he continues, the Goldwater campaign and the conservative efforts that will follow are parts of the decades-long assault on the walls of fortress liberalism. On the day after the election, he says, we must emerge smiling, confident in the knowledge that we weakened those walls, that they will never again stand so firmly against us. As prophecy not too shabby. In the late 1960s and early 70s, we see Buckley engaged on different battlefields. The New Left spread a poisonous anti-Americanism. It even infected the right. And so Buckley set about defending America, assailing a little less and celebrating our national heritage a little more. Buckley emerges in the 70s as a calming influence. He seeks to diffuse the passions that threaten to blow libertarians apart from their conservative allies. He seems to become more interested in the ideas of the American founders. The 1980s brought Buckley's friend Ronald Reagan to the White House. Buckley's talks become more engaged with issues of day-to-day governance. There are even speeches on economics as Buckley sets out to defend Reaganomics. One can see the influence of George Gilder. In 1984, a new character enters the scene, Blackford Oakes. Buckley gave a speech on the hero of his best-selling novels, and in his description of what makes Oakes a hero, one begins to perceive another shift in Buckley's field of interest from public virtue to private virtue. Many of the talks in the latter part of this book are given in honor of some friend or hero, Claire Booth, Lucy, John Simon, Jack Kemp, Andrei Sakharov, Vladimir Bukovsky. None of these talks is solely about private character, because none of them are private individuals, but Buckley seems to be exploring what he means to lead a noble life. What it means to lead a noble life. Some will say he mellows as he gets older. It's hard to dismiss it. As you read his remarks to the 40th reunion at the Yale class of 1950, reflect back on the remarks he made to that same class 4 decades before, the first speech in this book. But saying that Buckley has mellowed does not explain away the evidence we have before us. The world has changed for the better. In the latter part of the book, Buckley addresses audiences at conservative societies and think tanks that came into being during the course of his career and that he himself inspired. He's not only he's not a lonely fighter anymore. It would be odd if he continued to behave like one. Some conservatives seem to grow more sour even as conservative ideas are more widely accepted. Even as communism dies and capitalism triumphs, they insist on their own marginalization and savor it. I don't really agree with that, but but Buckley, though a conservative, a controversialist, seeks pleasure, not pain. If he seems less offended in the latter speeches in this book, maybe there is less to be offended by. The country has gone through many changes over the past 5 decades, and one of the revelations of this book is how Buckley has changed too. In the latter speeches, in particular, we see the trait that makes him distinctive. When people learn that I worked briefly at National Review and ask me what Bill Buckley is like, the thing I always mention first in his capacity is his capacity for friendship. We all see the energy he puts into his speeches and columns and television appearances, but lots of people work hard. What is distinctive about Buckley is the energy he puts into his friendships. The world might be different if he didn't have this gift. By the time I got to National Review in 1984, it was a convivial ship. We were all so wrapped up in admiration for managing editor Priscilla Buckley that we weren't in a mood to feud. But in the early days, apparently, National Review was like a crowded alley in the Appalachians, with rifle fire from shed to shed. It must have been Buckley's talent for companionship that kept the brilliant but ornery editors together, and a friendship that threads its way back through this book is drawn from that era, the one with Whittaker Chambers. Buckley quotes Chambers several times in these speeches. Each quoting is a gem, and each is introduced with an unmistakable tone of devotion. Perhaps this talent for friendship has something to do with Buckley's prolific speechifying. Think of it, thousands of speeches over dozens of years, tens of thousands of listeners, hundreds of thousands of airplane miles. Why give so many speeches? And why do we show up for speakers like Buckley? After all, if it is mere information and arguments we want, a magazine article is a more efficient way to get it. An article is on the page, so you can go over it again and again if your mind wanders. You can save it for later reference. And if it's simply Buckley's locutions you want to hear, you can sit at home and watch him on TV. But live encounters offer something more, a personal connection that is the seed of friendship. For all Buckley's contributions to conservative ideas, his most striking contribution is to the conservative personality. He made being conservative attractive and even glamorous. One suspects that more people were inspired by his presence at these events than were converted by the power of mere logic. It would be wonderful if we could go back and watch these clashes firsthand. It would be even more wonderful if we could go back armed with the knowledge we now possess. That in most cases, subsequent events have proved that Buckley's tormentors were wrong, and he, it transpires, was right. And so I hope you all enjoyed that foreword, and I will continue reading from William F. Buckley, probably in the next week. Thank you. Good night.